Hello, everyone. Let me just mute that. So, all right. So this is my first live. I want to welcome everybody who's online. First off, can you hear me okay? Someone can just drop a comment to let me know if you can hear me, and if not, I'll try a different microphone. I see no comment. Okay. And forgive me if I keep going back and forth here. I've got this being my first live. I'm kind of monitoring on YouTube over here to see how it looks from your perspective. And I also have my notes over here. So I may be looking over there. Thanks for interpreting, Huckleberry. I wasn't sure what the 5x5 meant. So right now, I think I already mentioned we got a good group on here. We've got Huckleberry from Florida, Freedom Lover from Maine, Jeffrey Evans from Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and then George from Iowa. So a pretty good already, a pretty good difference in the locales that we're dealing with. And that's good because I'd like to get a little discussion on differences in winterizing in different areas. I want to start out with just a little introduction. I've interacted with several of you before, and I welcome all of you onto this live broadcast, and I welcome everyone who is watching this in the replay. If you are, go ahead and take part. Leave your comments, leave comments and questions, and I'll try to respond to those. But I want to give a little background on myself and share that this is all very, this whole YouTube thing, I kind of stumbled into it. I posted my first YouTube video, which some of you might have seen is just my comparison of the different frame types. And I posted that just to share with some friends who had seen my posts on Facebook about Layens and Langstroth hives, who told me they had no idea what I was talking about. So I shared that just to clear that up. And the rule on YouTube is the first video you make will be your worst video. And that video has still outperformed every other video I've made. So that's kind of crazy to me. But from there, I just started adding stuff out there. Never intended to really grow much on YouTube, but now I'm at about 2,600 subscribers, which is huge for me, small in YouTube terms, but it kind of boggles my mind. But I appreciate everyone who watches, who takes part on the channel, who comments and all that. It's kind of overwhelming, actually, because I don't consider myself to be a beekeeping expert. Like most all of you, I am a learner. I may be a little bit ahead on my learning journey than some, and I just want to share the information that I learn. And one thing I've learned is that a lot of people get value out of that, and so I really appreciate that, and I'll keep trying to give that value. I try never to speak beyond my own knowledge. I don't want to be to use terms from my country upbringing. I don't want to get too big for my britches, but I'll try to keep sharing information that's useful. And this live is part of that. When I was getting close to 2,000 subscribers, I promised or threatened, take it how you want, that I was going to do a live to celebrate 2,000 subscribers. And well, I'm finally getting around to it. So here we are. I had somebody suggest for a live broadcast that I do a video on the cost of beekeeping, and I think that's a good topic. I'll probably try to do that one later, but I thought right now I would talk a little bit about winterizing, because it's pretty timely, because that's where we're at this year. And I saw that Freedom Lover already has their hives wrapped up, and so they're ahead of me, and I'm sure Huckleberry, I'd be interested to hear from you. If you even wrap your hives down in Florida? So we'll chat a little bit about the locale differences. But starting out, I think one thing that's been a part of my beekeeping philosophy from the very beginning is that in order to be a good beekeeper, you need to learn about bees. And I get a little frustrated with beekeeping education that teaches just practices, tells you steps, do this, now do this, now do that. Because, and maybe it's just my learning style, I have always had problems memorizing sequences of steps. But if I can learn how things work, then I can better understand why to do things with them. So if you can understand how bees overwinter, then you can understand better how to prepare them for winterization. And that's kind of the approach that I try to take in sharing information. Starting out, I'd like to get just a little information from the people who are on here. And, first off, if you have been beekeeping, however long, if you kept bees over the last winter, I'd like to know what your success rate was last winter as far as survival. And not trying to shame anyone. If you had a hard winter, that's part of it. And if you haven't kept bees over winter, I'd be interested to know how many hives are you going into winter with. So if you want to share that in the comments, it'd be interesting to hear kind of where people are at in terms of either having overwintered last year or where you're at going into this winter. And you can see I'm kind of playing with some of the StreamYard toys here. We've got the little banners we can pop up. So while you're sharing that information, I'll talk a little bit getting into, for those of you who have watched my videos, if you happen to stumble into this broadcast video and have not seen any of my other videos, welcome. Glad you're here. And I want to share that I consider myself a natural beekeeper. And lately, for some reason, there's a lot of contention about what that means. I've seen some people say if you're putting hives into a box of any sort, you're not a natural beekeeper. If they're not in a log or something, then it's not natural. My personal definition of being a natural beekeeper is that I try to work with the nature of the bees, basically in the way that George Layens talked about. I really like George Layens' philosophy of, you raise local bees, put them in a suitable hive, and basically let them do what they do best. That's not his exact words, that's my paraphrase. But, and that's kind of the philosophy I try to follow. Oh, and by the way, I am sharing, I'm wearing this shirt from the Sodbuster line, so to speak. This shirt is on the Suburban Sodbuster website, my What Would George DeLayens shirt, Layens Do shirt. So if you're a Layens hive keeper and want to confuse people that you see on the street, the shirt is out there on the website. So seeing where people are at, I see Freedom Lover had 20 hives and 15 made it. That, when I got into beekeeping, my expectation was I would probably lose about 50% every year. So I'd say that's pretty good. And I'm in Maine, I'm sure you have pretty harsh winters. So that is probably pretty decent. Jeffrey Evans last year lost one last year and moved the other from Oklahoma to Missouri. So just started Layens this year. And then John, and forgive me if I mispronounce your last name, Bethke, 10 for 10 in Western Michigan. That's pretty good. Again, farther north you go, it seems to me the harder it would be. Here in Missouri, our winters are up and down. We'll have a week of, double digits below zero, and then follow it up with a week where it's almost 70. So temperatures are weird here, but we don't have the long, harsh winters that you do farther north. So 10 for 10, 7 layings, 2 layings. And that's really good. I had similar results last year. I try not. George, 4 of 4 survived. Awesome. First year, 4 of 4 survived. Second, 4 of 8. So going into winter with 11 colonies. And yeah, I was getting ready to say I had a good winter last winter. I went into winter with 8 colonies. All 8 survived. I'm real happy about that, but I try not to brag on it because I know that every year is going to be different. And in fact, going into this winter, I have a few colonies that I will honestly be surprised if they make it through winter. And Freedom Lover, I agree. I think the deep frames are real beneficial. I described the reasons I think that on that frame comparison video, and I think it's very helpful. Having said that, I do have three. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I have three Langstroth colonies that I've tried doing single deep brood chamber management this year. So I'm going into winter. I'm going to try to winterize those, or overwinter those three hives on each one on a single deep brood box. I'll talk about my plan for that. We'll see how it goes. Just kind of experimenting. Huckleberry first season beekeeping. Okay, just moved to Florida. So going back to what I was saying about the natural practices, I think one thing that I try to consider anytime I do something in the hives is that every manipulation you do takes one step away from what would naturally occur. If I'm going to do anything to the hives, I'll ask myself the question of who would do this for the bees in the trees? If I'm thinking about feeding the colonies, well, nobody's going to feed the bees that live in trees. I'm treatment free. I have never treated any of my colonies. Nobody does it for the bees in trees. But of course, also nobody harvests honey from the bees in trees. And I do harvest honey. For the bees in trees, they're swarming. Well, I'm in the suburbs. I try not to let my colonies swarm. This spring will seem like a crazy season for swarms. So that was an issue for me, even having done splits. But nobody is doing splits for the bees in the trees. So everything we do to our hives takes us one step away from the natural. But I think the ultimate goal is, I think of it like a highway, the natural beekeeping path. We're going down a highway. And if I do a manipulation to the hives, I want it to be similar to if I take an exit ramp and then get right back onto the highway. I don't want to take the bees too far off of their natural path. And, I don't want to take a huge detour and get the bees thrown way off. If feeding is one thing, I don't feed my hives in the spring, or at least I haven't fed my hives in the spring. I wouldn't say that I never would, but if you feed the hives and build them up in the spring, getting ready for the spring flow, and then the spring flow doesn't happen, now you've got a big bulked up hive that's not getting that nectar coming in. So you got to keep feeding. So you can start to get off of that off ramp and take a detour and end up way off of that path the more you do to manipulate the hives. But I digress. But that's kind of the gist of my personal natural beekeeping philosophy. So then we come into winter. And, as we talked about, we've got lots of people on here representing different areas. And winterization is very locale dependent. What Freedom Lover is doing is going to be different than what Huckleberry is doing. And even, George of Iowa Layens beekeeping, you're not that far. You're just north of me, one state north of me, George, but your practices are going to still be a little different than mine. Maybe even just based on the time. Here where I'm at, our last frost date, everything, I try to guide everything by frost dates. And our last frost date is first frost date is typically October 15th. Last frost is mid-April, tax day, April 15th. And so everything kind of goes around that for us. So wherever you're located, you'll have to, whatever we talk about tonight should be kind of tailored to your location. Winter planning, I'm doing this video now as we're going into winter, but really, if you want to try to plan for the bees to go into winter naturally, winter planning starts in the spring. And, in the spring when things are easy, there's a big nectar flow, the bees are bulking up, they're storing lots of nectar and everything. Everything's going great. It's real easy then. But as you're doing splits and everything, and especially as you start to get into summer, whenever I do anything with the hives, I start thinking about how is this going to affect these hives and their preparation for winter. When I harvest honey in the spring, I don't follow the conventional beekeeping practice of harvesting all the honey and then feeding the bees to make up for it. Instead, I will harvest the honey and I will leave full frames of honey for the bees as we go into our summer dearth period, which for us is typically August into September, until we start to hit a little bit of a fall nectar flow. And so I try to leave that honey for the bees to get through the dearth, thinking then once they get into a fall flow, hopefully they'll build up some to get ready for winter. So I'm always trying to think ahead on that calendar, on that nectar calendar, and how well are the bees going to be prepared for winter based on what I do now in June. So when I harvest only the surplus honey. And once we start getting into that summer dearth, and it took me a couple seasons to learn this, but after in springtime, you got that fall flow. Bees are building comb like crazy. They're filling out the hives with nectar like crazy. And then we hit the summer dearth and even in the fall flow, and the bees just don't build much comb at all. And that frustrated me. My first year. If any of you have seen my video series on the conversion hive and trying to get the bees to move on to the Layens frames, you might have seen that, as I was getting into late summer, I was trying to get the bees to build out comb and they just kind of stalled out. But they just don't want to build comb at that time. So when I start to get into the summer dearth, I'll go into the hives and I'll pull out any excess frames. And I'll usually leave at least one partially built frame, leave a little buffer there for them to build on, but let them, once we get into that fall flow, I want them to fill up the frames they have and not be trying to put nectar across multiple frames. So I start condensing the hives even back in the fall dearth, or the summer dearth. Now, when we get into winter, and let me back up just a little bit on the comments, Freedom Lover, you only feed the weak colonies just before winter. And that's the same thing I do. I've got a few. I mentioned I have some weak colonies for winter, and I'm feeding those right now, hoping for the best. Once we get into winter, and you may all be familiar with how bees overwinter, I'm just going to give a quick talk through that for those who might not. Once we get into winter, the bees are going to form a cluster in the middle of the colony. So they're going to basically form a ball of bees, and the colder it gets, the more compact that cluster is going to be. The bees, as they go across the frames, they're going to be, shoving themselves into the cells and everything to conserve their heat in that cluster. During the year when they are laying, when the queen is laying, they need to maintain a temperature of 95 degrees. Once they get into that cluster over winter and they don't have brood, they can, maintain a temperature of about 50 degrees. Their goal is to keep the queen alive. And so they've got this cluster with the queen roughly at the center and the oldest bees at the outside. Those are going to be the first to die off. And that cluster will generally move vertically on the frames, but it typically doesn't move horizontally across frames. It'll move, in the line of the frames, so the bees can move back and, that cluster can move back and forth within the frames that they're on, if I'm saying that clearly enough. But where there's, frames dividing, they can't really move that cluster across those frames without breaking the cluster to go around. So they don't typically do that unless the weather warms up some. And that's kind of another factor of locale. Here in Missouri, I'm sure that, it gets cold, they cluster, warms up, they kind of break cluster, and they're probably make clustering and breaking cluster over and over during the winter. But because they can't, that cluster is kind of confined to those frames on which they're clustering, and they're going to be moving generally vertically on those frames to try to feed. So you want to make sure to have enough nectar at the tops of those frames. And this is where, like Freedom Lover said, the deep frames are great for that, because they can put a nice band of honey at the top of the frames, and that cluster can just move up. Last year I did overwinter a colony on a double deep hive. Didn't have a problem with it. And several people have left comments on my frame comparison video telling me, in so many words, that I'm kind of full of garbage because they've never had problems. But I don't like the gap between frames, because that cluster has to move across that gap if they're moving up to the second set of frames to get to the honey. So I like having just deep frames for those bees to winter on. Now they can also move to the ends. So on a Langstroth frame where they have honey on the ends and the cluster in the middle, they can move towards the ends to get to that honey. The problem is that the honey that's above them will be warmed up by the heat of that cluster. And so when they get to those, it'll be liquefied. If they're going sideways, heat doesn't move sideways, it rises. So that honey that's on the sides may not be as readily accessible to the bees. I don't know. Let me back up. I said earlier, I try not to speak outside of my knowledge. I don't know if there's ever been a study done that, bees with honey on the ends of the frames versus the top are more likely to starve out. I don't know. But I do know that the honey that's above them is easier for them to access, because that heat is rising and keeping that honey fairly warm. I already mentioned they are going to maintain temperature within that cluster. And I use the Layens 20 frame insulated hives. That's my preference. I have others that are different, but that's my preference. And I think by managing the temperature within the hive, you help the bees to manage the temperature within their cluster. They don't have to heat the whole hive. And I didn't mention, for those who don't know, the way that they maintain that temperature is by vibrating their wing muscles. But they just have to keep that cluster warm. So some have said insulated hives are unnecessary because they don't have to heat the whole hive. However, the better the air around them, the air temperature around them is managed, the less they have to work to maintain the temperature within that cluster. And the less honey they're going to have to consume, because they're going to be burning fewer calories to maintain that temperature. So I think an insulated hive works really well for the bees. Another point of contention, as well, let me mention my next topic, and then I'll come back. But the other one is moisture concerns. A lot of people are concerned about having too much moisture in the colony over winter. And I could be proven wrong. But last year I did an experiment, with my Langstroth hive, kind of an experiment. I wrapped it up in insulation. I put an insulated box on top of the hive, and I completely sealed it, duct taped it closed. And the duct tape, it wasn't really to try to seal it so much as I was using it so that water and snow would run off of the lid onto the insulation that was on the sides. But it worked out. I put the duct tape on and just left it closed until I opened the hive until spring. So there was no ventilation going out the top. And a lot of people will say, and like I said, I could be proven wrong on this, but a lot of people will say that you have to have some sort of top ventilation to allow that moist air to vent out so that there's not too much moisture in the hive. For my own supposition, okay, so let me say that this is me supposing, I think top ventilation could be more of a detriment, more of a harm than a benefit. And the reason is because those bees are trying to maintain temperature in their cluster. As they do, they're generating heat. That heat's going to rise. If you have top ventilation on that hive, and so that air is rising and flowing out, then the air that's flowing out has to be replaced by air from someplace else. So that cool air is going to be drawn in from the bottom, and you're going to have a chimney effect of this air flowing through as the bees are going to be fueling that as they heat up their cluster. So they're going to be working harder to maintain temperature because you're constantly pulling cool air into that hive, and they're going to be eating more food over the winter to have the calories to maintain that temperature. So I don't like the idea of top ventilation. And that colony that was in the Langstroth hives, when I did cut that duct tape off and opened up the hive, they were booming. So it certainly didn't hurt them. Now, one hive is not a proof, but it certainly didn't hurt them. I think what does matter with moisture, let's see, Freedom Lover, would you please talk about how the bees cannot relieve themselves for 5 months? Okay, I'll mention that. And I might have you give some input on that as well, because like I mentioned, our temperatures fluctuate more here, so our bees may not have to wait quite that long. But coming back to the moisture, I don't think moisture within the hive necessarily kills the bees. Over the winter, when the bees have opportunities to break cluster, they're going to need water. And if there's condensation on the sides of the hive, that's pretty much their only water source over winter. What does harm the bees in the cluster is if that moisture condenses at the top of the hive and that water drips down and then chills that cluster. That could kill a hive. So with insulation on the top of the hive, to prevent that condensation from happening right above the bees, I think you can avoid the issues that the moisture can cause for the colony. Otherwise, having high humidity within the hive, I don't think is a real detriment. Freedom Lover, so like I was just saying, asked about how the bees cannot relieve themselves for 5 months. And this is true. When the bees are in the cluster, they have to hold it. And and you'll often see and this is where as asking a Freedom Lover, maybe you can give a little input from your area, because I'm sure in Maine, you're seeing much longer periods of cold weather than we are here. But what I often see in my area is when the temps start to get up around 40 degrees, you will see bees starting to come out and take, I'm blanking out, basically take flights to relieve themselves. And especially once the weather really warms up in spring, they come out and they are covering everything around the hives in poop. So don't panic if you go out in spring or during a warm period, during the winter. If you go out and you see the top of your hives or cleansing flight, thank you, Huckleberry, and you see, on the top of your hive or on anything around the hives, you see all these little yellow, bee poop all over, or in front of the hive. There's snow in front of the hive. You might notice it on the snow. First time I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, my bees are sick. But it's just, they've got to get out and relieve themselves. They haven't over the winter. So they've been moving that cluster up, eating the honey, and no place to defecate over the winter. So they're taking those cleansing flights. Freedom Lover uses baby's diapers and pillow for moisture dripping. Yeah, good idea. I use, in the Langstroth hive, I took a box, just a spacer box that's actually used for a feeder, and I stapled fabric to one side of it and then put rock wool insulation in it. And so put that on top of the hive. I did put it on top of an inner cover so that the bees wouldn't totally propolize it all together. But that way the fabric will kind of absorb the moisture, and it shouldn't drip down much. And it worked well. I did not have any, when I opened up the hive, I didn't see any signs of excess moisture, meaning I didn't see any mold or anything on the inner cover. I did see above the insulation, where you have the top of the box, my telescoping cover, And then below that was the insulation. So you had the cold above that and then the warmer air below that. So I did see a little bit of mold on the inside of that telescoping cover. And that's fine. That was 3 inches away from the bees and separated by rock wool insulation. So I wasn't concerned about that. So yeah, fabric, in the Layens hives, in my Layens hives, I use, the top bars in my hives touch. So the tops of the bars, the frames themselves, make a ceiling over the bees. And then I'll put a pillow over top of that. And, just a pillowcase stuffed with, in some cases I use rock wool insulation, but when I have it available, I'll use sheep's wool. But, and I have never had a problem with mold on the tops of the frames. I have occasionally had some on the end of the hive, but I'm not too concerned about that. That kind of comes back to, if this were a tree cavity, you're going to have, mold occurring naturally. As long as it's not like a huge issue in there, I don't stress over it too much. Jeffrey Evans, should I completely close the entrance for winter? I'm going to table that question for just a second, because I'm going to talk about what I do for winterizing the Layens hive. I kind of started myself on that path already. So I already mentioned during summer dearth, I start to reduce the number of frames. I mentioned that's so that the bees are consolidating their nectar resources more on the frames that they're going to use for overwintering. But it also benefits as we get into the summer, we get into the strong hive beetle season. That gives less extra frames for those hive beetles to live on. So you kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone with that. Once I go in and do the actual winterization, I will condense the colony further. My first year going into winter, I was frustrated because I felt like, I wanted to have my colonies on as many frames as possible. And at that time, my colonies were pretty small. So I was winterizing on 5 frames. And I've seen some people posting comments on Facebook asking about, well, I'm trying to get my hive up to 15 frames before winter or whatever. And I think that's the wrong direction. Going into winter, my suggestion is to condense your hives down to where you have the bees heavily populated on a few frames. So just enough frames to support your colony of bees without them spilling out the sides, so to speak. Any excess frames than that, I think, is a waste. When you have your bees tightly condensed, they're going to be able to moderate their heat better. And so, rather than trying to go into winter with lots of frames, you want to go into with lots of bees on just a few frames. And then, I mentioned you want a full nectar frame on each end. So if you have, 2 full honey frames, those should bookend the other frames. If you don't have full honey frames, but you have a couple frames that are half full, just leave those. That honey is not for overwintering. That's what the bees are going to go to in the spring when they break cluster and start raising brood. For the bees over winter, we already mentioned you want your honey band on the top of the frames they're going to be clustering on. And how big that honey band should be will probably depend on where you're located. In the farther south you get, you probably need less of a honey band. The bees are going to need less calories to get through winter. Farther north you go, you probably want to have at least 5 inches of honey at the top of each frame on a Layens frame. I do have to say, I'll digress just a little bit. When it comes to winterizing the Layens frames, this is one of the things that won me over to Layens hives. There's a lot of things I really love about the Layens hives, but when I had read Keeping Bees with a Smile, and based on that, I had built a double deep hive for Lazuten frames or Langstroth. And then when I went to Dr. Leo's seminar and I saw him winterizing his Layens frame, it was just so easy. He wasn't doing calculations on pounds of honey or anything. It was just leave a frame of honey on each end. In the middle, you want frames that have honey bands at the top, and there you go. It was just so stupid simple that it frustrates me now, following Facebook forums and people doing all sorts of calculations about how much honey they have to keep in their hive over winter, and how many pounds and so on. And it just seems like a lot of excess work, but that's just my thought, my commentary there. So then, so we've got our frames on the ends, we've got our honey band at the top, we've got, and then insulation on the top. Now I was using hives, was using ventilated lids. So the lids, if anybody has used Dr. Leo's plans from horizontalhive.com, you have the lids that have the holes drilled in the end. And I have, I see George from Iowa Layens Beekeeping, his hives are fully insulated with no venting. And I've gone the same direction this year. I have, I put a layer of rock wool. I took my insulated lids and put a layer of rock wool in them, and then just covered that over with a sheet of thin plywood. And then the lids I built this year, I didn't drill vents at all. I just filled them with rock wool insulation. I was hoping that would provide some hedge against comb collapse over the summer, but I didn't see a lot of difference in that. I was thinking maybe the fact that you have insulation, preventing the solar radiated heat from getting right into the hive might help with comb collapse. I still had some comb collapse, nothing terrible, but I don't know that the insulation helped with that. But we'll see how it goes over winter. I don't think bees need all that much insulation. Based on Dr. Tom Seeley's research, the bees look for a snug cavity with a small lower entrance. They don't look for cavities that are drafty or have lots of ventilation. Not that they can't live in it, but I'm kind of following that practice. But then, even if you use the ventilated lids, you want to have some insulation on top of the frames in the Layens hive, so that you don't have that space at the top of the frames where you have cold air on top and then the warmer air underneath. Otherwise, you are going to get that condensation on those top bars above the bees. And we don't want that. Now, having insulated my hives this year, I will probably be just taking a thin sheet of insulation board and laying it on top of the frames. There's about 3/4 of an inch maybe between the tops of the frames and the bottom of the plywood that I have under the insulation. So I'll just put a sheet in there to fill that gap, and that'll be my insulation for the top. Okay, Freedom Lover, does the size of the colony matter for good winter survival? Yes, and I don't think I can give an authoritative voice to say your colony has to be, a certain size. But yeah, the bigger your colony is going into winter, the better. They are not, especially in your area where it's going to be cold over winter, they are not going to be raising brood over the winter. Now, if you have some southern, some Italian bees, they're brood producers. They're not necessarily, cold weather bees. So I don't know what your source of bees is, but, Italian bees, I think wherever you have them, they're going to try to raise brood. But for the most part, if you are raising local bees, they're going to be kind of shutting down brood production over the winter. So they're not making bees, but they're going to be losing bees. Winter bees do live longer, but there is going to be some loss over winter. So the more bees you have to start, the better. Now, what's that minimum size that a colony can survive over winter? I don't know, and I'm sure it's locale dependent. I have one colony right now that I did a late season split. There was somebody who wanted a nucleus colony. And earlier in the year, she wanted one and decided against it. And then she came back and said that she wanted one after all. So I had this colony. I made a late season split. I had a few frames left over from that. I let the bees raise a new queen. They did, but they're pretty weak right now. I think they're probably a little small, but it's just thumb in the wind. Does this colony look strong and viable and big enough to get through winter? I'm not sure what those numbers are. Yeah, a good queen probably would survive winter, and really, part of that is because a good queen will produce a lot of brood to produce those winter bees going into winter. George, Carniolan and Russian bees go into winter with smaller colonies, and that may be true. That's one thing I haven't really monitored a lot in my hives, and I don't know. My bees are all Missouri mutts. They've come from cutouts, trap outs, caught swarms, so they are whatever I get. They're just local mutt bees, and they have been very healthy, but I couldn't tell you, what their variety is. Swarmstad, hey, good to see you, Bruce. So let's see, where was it? So I talked about the Layens hives, and Jeffrey Evans asked the question, should I completely close the entrance for winter? No. I would, now if you have some weather coming up that it's going to be 10 below for a couple weeks, you might, close your entrance down some. For the most part, of course, on my hives, I use the rotating disc entrance, and I will shut it down to where it has just a little football shaped opening, just big enough for maybe 2 bees to get through. Because when that weather warms up a little bit, you're going to have some bees wanting to come out and take their cleansing flights. And so you don't want to block that off. You don't want them, having to do that inside the hive. And I generally leave it like that over winter, even with, we have storms come through and stuff. That small entrance doesn't seem to have been a problem. So that's kind of the Layens hives and what I do in the Layens. Now, I got started in the Layens hives. That's what I'm comfortable with. I keep bees in the Langstroth hives because I want to have the comparative experience. So if someone comes with me and asks me how things would work in the Langstroth or Layens, or compare the two, or someone accuses me of saying, well, you don't know how it is in Langstroth. I want to know how it is with Langstroth. I will say I still prefer my Layens, but I'll save that commentary for another time. But when I start winterizing in the Layens hives, I kind of follow the same rules. Going in with my Langstroth. Going into winter with my one Langstroth colony last year, I didn't weigh how much honey they had or anything. I basically just want to check and make sure that the bees have honey on the ends that they're going to use for spring, and they have good honey at the top of the frames they're going to be clustering on, and let them go at it. So kind of following the same rules. I kind of look at the, and someone on here may very rightfully so say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. Langstroth is not my forte, but it's, as I look at the Langstroth hive, if I look at a 10 frame box, I'm accustomed to the horizontal format of the Layens hive. So I kind of look at a Langstroth box as a horizontal 10 frame hive. And I will say this year, I'm experimenting with single deep brood management. One thing that kind of frustrated me with that is that because of the nature of the hive, you really can't go into winter without feeding. You kind of have to feed to bulk them up to go into winter on a single deep. And I tried to go without that, tried to get around that, but I just couldn't. They just didn't have the honey on their middle frames to overwinter. So I'm feeding those hives. I think next year, maybe as an experiment, I never really, although it was my original plan, I never really used the Lazutin frames, the double deep Langstroth width frames. And I think I'm going to try to convert some of my Langstroth hives to Lazutin, using 2 deep boxes stacked, but use Lazutin frames for the brood. We'll see how that goes. So what's your thoughts on candy board? Jeffrey, my next bullet point was feeding over winter. So perfect segue. Thank you very much for following the script. I do not use candy boards. I don't feed over, my practice has been, again, I won't never say never, but I feed the hives that need it going into winter, but I don't feed over winter. Now, if somebody, feels the need to do that, I'm not telling somebody, you're a horrible person if you do it or anything. I would rather close up the hives in the fall, winterize them, get them ready, make sure they have the resources, and then let them sit until spring. But that's my thought. Freedom lover, wind breaking around the hives. I don't think there's any harm to it at all. I haven't done it, but my hives, in my backyard are fairly sheltered to some degree. I say that having lost my cheapy greenhouse to strong winds, but any additional shelter certainly wouldn't help. I'm not a big fan of, I know some people, especially in the far north, and I don't live in the, deep cold areas of Maine or northern Michigan or anything, or Canada. So I know some people in the farther north will move their hives inside of sheds over winter. I'm not a fan of changing the bees' climate that much, but again, I don't live in those environments. So it may be the case that, that's in some areas that may be about the only way to get your hives through winter. I don't know. Yeah, and Jeffrey using straw bales. So, again, I don't think you're really doing much to change the climate of the bees. They're still out in the cold, but you're just protecting those hives from, the worst of the winter blasts. So that kind of covered, and hopefully I didn't ramble too much, but that kind of covers my preparation for winter, starting in spring and going through the summer dearth and then moving into winter and how I prepare the hives. So any commentary from any of the rest of you on where you're at, or do you do anything different? Any different thoughts about how you prepare your hives for winter, or any questions? I got a thumbs up from Bruce Rodriguez. I take that as high praise. I got to tell you, everyone who's on here, I appreciate you being on here. And this is the weirdest thing, carrying on a conversation with myself being the only one talking and reading your comments. I just something to get used to, but I guess that's a rite of passage, learning how to do your first live. So I appreciate all you being on here. Jeffrey, you are down by Poplar Bluff. That's kind of in Elizabeth's area, the curly-haired country gal. Do you know Elizabeth? And while you respond, I'll respond to Jer's question here. It says, when do you harvest the honey? First frost? I am actually, like I said, our first frost is mid-October. We have according to the weather forecasters, we have about another week of warm weather going on here. We're in the 80s right now here in Missouri where I'm at, and we have about another week of that. And then they said it's going to cool off the following week. We're going to see more fall-like temperatures. So I am planning to harvest this coming Monday while it's still warm. I want to try to pull the honey while it's warm, get the hives closed up before it's cold, give the bees an opportunity to kind of restore that the propolis seal in the hives. So I don't wait until first frost. And there could be an argument for doing that to milk out as much as you can from the fall flow, but I don't mind. I'll pull it when it's warm and let the bees keep whatever else they can get from the fall flow. If they can add to their, once I close it, I pull the excess. Now I'm rambling. Pull the excess honey and leave them with enough to get through winter. If they can store up any more, great, more power to them. Oh, so Jeffrey, I see you took one of her classes. So yeah, I kind of acted as a mentor for Elizabeth, and pretty cool to see her sharing information in the classes that she's been putting on. Now, I'm actually jealous of her that she has had the time and opportunity to put on those classes. So I'd kind of like to do more of that in-person stuff. But well, folks, like I said, I appreciate you coming on. Somehow I didn't ramble beyond an hour. We're down to 50 minutes. So I'm going to head and if anybody has another question to throw out there, that's fine. If you later on start thinking of something that, this video will be out on YouTube. Oh, Freedom Lover, how many hives do you have? I started this year with 8 hives. And I had a goal of ending the year with 12. Well, right now I'm at 13, but one of those, like I mentioned, looks super weak. I don't think it's going to survive through winter. So I'm kind of hitting that mark. So right now, let's just say I'm at 12 hives. But that is after, I sold 7 nucleus colonies this year. So it's been kind of a crazy year of up and down, but I'm, ending up about where I wanted to be with 12 colonies. We'll see where things stand in the spring. All right. So thanks a lot, everybody. If you think of any additional questions, oh, I see. keep them coming, Freedom Lover. How do I get my queens? I let my colonies make their queens. If I do a split, I will, if I do a split, I let the side that's queenless, make their own queen. I try to do all my splits in the spring when I start to see drones. This year, I probably jumped the gun a little bit because after I made splits, I still had swarms like crazy. So I should probably wait a little longer, get a little bit into swarm season so that when I make a split, it's like an artificial swarm. But I digress. When I make those splits, I let the colony that's queenless raise their own queen. I have bought queens before, and I've only once. I bought 2 queens because I had a colony that needed a queen. So I bought 2 just to have an extra. And when I found somebody who is local to me who had queens that he had raised from his local survivor stock, and I got those queens. The one I put into the hive turned out to be a dud. I ended up removing her and combining that hive. The other queen I had put into another colony just kind of as a resource colony, had some bees in there, had 5 frames, went into winter with low expectations. They came out of winter this year, still alive. They grew into one of my strongest hives. I was super stoked about making splits from them next year, and then they swarmed this summer. So, yeah, I mean, they didn't swarm, they absconded, just took off. So lost that one. But other than those 2 queens, I always raise my own. Next time you can share the link to join you on the screen. Yeah, I do plan to try to do that, starting out slow. Kept it just me on the screen this time, but as I play around with StreamYard and learn the tool, I do plan to do more, bring people online and talk more in person. Swarmstead, are you going to any conference? I don't have any particular plans right now to go to any beekeeping conferences. I do have plans to go to some homesteading expos next year. I know I will have a booth at the Oki Homesteading Expo, which is in March of next year. I was hoping to speak, but they said they already had a beekeeper speaking. So, and I may also be at the Ozarks Homesteading Expo, which will be next September, and possibly the Indiana Expo, which will be next October, I think. Huckleberry, do you set up your Frank nukes as Langstroth or Layens frames. I set up my nukes with Layens, and you know, I've had enough people that were looking for Layens nukes that's been a pretty good niche to provide those Layens nukes. And Jeffrey Evans, I found out a few weeks ago that adding extra wax to wax, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about adding wax to wax foundation, but if it works, why fight it? So let's see, where are we? All right, and Jeffrey Evans says, any other questions? So yeah, like I mentioned, and I plan on to have future, maybe I might make this a regular weekly thing or something. Probably Bruce, I'll probably try to bring you on sometime and talk, and you know, bring different people on to talk on different topics. So again, just learning the ropes here, and I've kind of enjoyed this, even though I feel like I'm talking to myself. I do appreciate the interaction of people commenting, so thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for joining this live stream. Hopefully you got something out of it. And if you think later of a question, starting to say earlier, if you think later of a question or a comment or a criticism of anything that I said here, feel free to come back to the YouTube video and add an additional comment, and we can keep the discussion going there. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good night. We'll see you on the next video.